morning. I think you're all waiting for me. I apologize. Just catching up with someone outside. My name is Nancy Yuen. I'm Vice President of the Asia Foundation here in Washington, D.C. We're delighted today to bring you a panel of experts to talk about issues of fragility and conflict in the region. I am happy to introduce Tom Parks, formerly of the Asia Foundation, but now currently with DFAT in Bangkok. He has been working on issues of conflict in Asia for quite some time, and we're delighted that he could be here today to help us moderate. As many of you know, the Asia Foundation has 18 offices in Asia. This is an area that we've been working with for quite some time, and I believe Tom will introduce the rest of it. So thank you so much, Tom.
Thanks, Nancy. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. It's a real privilege for me to be here. After 12 years with the Asia Foundation, I joined the Australian Aid Program about 2.5 years ago. And these are certainly old friends, and we sort of, in many ways, built the Asia Foundation's conflict program together. So it's really a privilege for me to be here and part of this. Just a few words to start off. A few years ago, several of us worked on a project called the Contested Corners of Asia, which sought to look at the unique dynamics around subnational conflicts in South and Southeast Asia. Now, many of you know that these are, here's the report. Now, this report was based on the idea that, that development assistance in many cases was operating with the wrong ideas about what was driving these conflicts. And then one of the key findings was that, in fact, the problems in these regions were very, very much around politics, around sort of political marginalization of ethnic minority groups, and many other similar factors. And that development assistance, in many cases, was actually playing right into that marginalization, and was often working with the wrong assumptions and pushing in the wrong direction. And so these findings, in many ways, resonated quite a bit with the wider community. The Australian Aid Program is situated in a region. Most of our programs are in South and Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And we've recognized increasingly that these findings around the politics around conflict, especially in subnational areas, is absolutely central in our region. In particular, because our region is primarily middle-income countries with fairly capable states, where the concepts around fragile states doesn't really apply. So there's other dynamics that are at play. A few weeks ago, Patrick Barron was in Canberra to present this study to my colleagues and others in the Australian policy community, and a great deal of resonance with what we're thinking and some of the challenges we're looking at. Just to give you an idea, we're in a situation now on the Australian side where we're really looking at the approaches that we've used in terms of state building and peace building over the last 10 years, and acknowledging that a lot of things need to change, and that we're really trying to think and look with fresh eyes in terms of how we're going to work on these problems in a different way. Part of the idea, part of what we've been involved in to date there's a community of practice among various donors. It's actually two. One is thinking and working politically, and another is doing development differently. I won't go into what those are, but basically these are agendas which are trying to create space for donors and implementing partners to work in more flexible, more politically smart ways to address really deep-seated challenges which are driving conflict in the region. And so we're definitely a part of this, and the Asia Foundation is really helping us make the case for working in new ways to address these very, very old problems. Just one last point by way of introduction too. As you know, across town at the World Bank, there's a big conference going on, the Fragility, Conflict, and Violence Fragility Forum, they call it, right? Interestingly, I was on a panel yesterday that was focused on security and justice. And in fact, actually, we spent about 10 minutes talking about security and justice issues, and we spent about 2 hours and 50 minutes talking about political problems and the political underlying factors that actually sustain problems around violence and conflict. So this report is extremely timely, and I think it's going to be valuable to see where this goes. So let me take a few minutes just to introduce the panelists. I'll go through all three at this stage. Patrick Barron is the Regional Director for Conflict and Development. He has 14 years of experience in programming and research on community development, subnational conflict and state fragility. Formerly, he spent several years at Oxford doing a PhD, and before that was with the World Bank for many years. Patty was one of our core contributors on the Contested Corners, and is really seen as one of the leading thinkers on conflict in Southeast Asia. Steve Rood, right here, is the longtime country representative of the Philippines. Steve has the honor of being the only non-Filipino the last non-Filipino to be tenured in the University of the Philippines, and has spent more than 30 years in the Philippines. Seen as one of the leading international experts on the Philippines and a long-time collaborator on trying to address the conflict problems in Mindanao. George Varughese is a country representative to Nepal, although he's taking a year sabbatical. He's currently a visiting professor at the University of Wyoming. George's claim to fame, among many, is the groundbreaking work that he did in Afghanistan from 2005 to 2009, I believe, at a time of real dynamism, and George was really trying to understand the politics of that very complex place and to see how the Asia Foundation could work in different ways, and really has been one of the leaders in this area. So let me go ahead and turn it to Patrick to get us started.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks to Nancy and others for giving us a chance to present some initial thinking today around these issues. Today I want to talk through a few different things based on this report here. I think there's copies of the front page, which will give you the web link if you want to download it. And the basic idea for why we wanted to do this paper and this project was that we think that basically there's a lack of fit between standard international approaches, the approaches of international donors and many international NGOs as well, to providing support to peace processes. There's a lack of fit between that and what we actually know about what shapes war to peace transitions. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking through what the literature and practice has kind of told us in recent years about why conflict occurs and how peace can be possible. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some ideas that have come from a different area of development. As Tom mentioned, ideas around thinking and working politically, doing development differently. These literatures and the people working on this have basically come to the conclusion that any kind of development change, and in particular change towards peace, requires understanding the politics of countries. And that requires ways for development actors to work differently. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those ideas, and then actually talk about how that may have implications for how international agencies like the Asia Foundation, like DFAT, like the World Bank and others should go about doing business working on these areas. And then I'll just talk very briefly about the broader research project we have in this area. So to start us off, a few things that we know about conflict. The first is that conflict and violence occurs because it's in the interests of some people for it to occur. You know, the literature 20, 30 years ago talked about things like grievances, talked about things like ethnic divides and ancient hatreds, and there was this kind of assumption that, you know, violence was something that was kind of inevitable when you had people with different identities together, whenever you had repressed groups and so on. I think we've moved our understanding quite a bit forward. Of course, grievances are important, but actually if we really want to understand why violence occurs and why it sustains, we need to understand who are the actors who have an actual interest in perpetrating it. You know, if someone wants to change something, they have many options. They can engage in a political process. They can find non-political forms of contention to move their agenda forward. And so we really need to understand what are the interests and the motives, what are the factors that make individuals think actually violence may be a way for me to push my agenda forward. So it's about interest and incentives. Second point is that conflict can occur not only in failing states and fragile states, but in relatively strong states as well. If we look globally, there is a pretty solid correlation between state fragility and the presence of large-scale violence and civil war, right? So it's no surprise that large parts of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, have been the sites of many of the largest, most violent wars that we've seen in recent decades. On the other hand, if you look at Asia, that's not the case. Now, of course, you have places like Afghanistan and Pakistan, but if you leave that aside, you have many middle-income states, many states where markets function, where state bureaucracies penetrate to the local level, where governments work. They may not be perfect, there may be problems of corruption and so on, where there are elections, and yet you see these problems of large-scale violence. And I'm thinking of places like southern Thailand. Southern Thailand is actually, in per capita terms, the most deadly conflict in Asia at the moment, outside of Pakistan and Afghanistan. And yet Thailand is very much a higher middle-income state. It has many political problems at the moment, but the government works. You know, they have civil servants and bureaucrats right down to the village level. They have functioning line ministries and so on. Places like Philippines as well. Places like Indonesia, where you have the civil war in Aceh as well. So conflict is not solely about state fragility. And this makes us think, well, if it's not about state fragility, maybe the approach to getting out of conflict by trying to build the capacity of state institutions, maybe there's some limitations to that. I think a third point that's become clear in the literature, and also for many of us who work on these issues in practical ways as well, is that the classic definition between conflict and post-conflict, between war and peace, doesn't really stand up most of the time. So traditionally, we think, you know, you have a war, and then you have a peace agreement, or maybe you have a military victory, and then you're in the post-conflict phase, and the violence will go away. And I think anyone who looks at any country that's going through a war to peace transition finds that it can see that that's most often not the case. And the classic examples here are those of Central America, places like Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador, where actually homicide levels in the so-called post-conflict period have actually been higher than during the Civil War. What we know is that violence tends not to go away, but tends to often morph and form, even if a peace settlement is fairly successful. So this classic demarcation between war and the post-conflict period doesn't stand up, and I argue that that has some implications for the types of programs we should design as well. And a final point that I think has become clear as well is that internationals are perhaps less important in determining whether a peace process will take place and hold than is commonly thought. Most of the time, these are about domestic political issues. International agencies and actors may shape those incentives, but ultimately, the key will be the extent to which people within the countries feel it is in their own interests to move towards a more peaceful solution. So given these things, the question that this paper and this project seeks to answer is, standard approaches to international peace building, are they really fit for practice? Do they fit with what we know about why conflict occurs, why violence occurs, and how successful war to peace transitions occur? And the answer is no. At least that's going to be my argument. So what is the standard international peace building approach? Well, in the paper, we call it the liberal peace building approach. This is nothing new. A lot of people have written about this. The basic idea is that there is a somewhat standard approach to peace building that has evolved over the past 40 or 50 years, actually a bit longer, since World War II. And in particular, since the end of the Cold War, you suddenly start to see much more international involvement in peace processes around the world. And you started to see a standard kind of toolkit emerge. Now, importantly, you've got to remember the time, after 1989, this is the time of Fukuyama, the end of history and so on, where there was this basic idea that there was one kind of sustainable model, and it was for development and for peace to take place. And it was basically this idea that you've got to build a liberal capitalist democratic state. And this led to this idea that state building and peace building should go hand in hand, and basically what should emerge should be something that looks like the kind of Bavarian states that we have in the West. In practice, this is translated into a kind of standard set of interventions, tools within the toolkit that international agencies tend to employ. These are things like doing DDR programs. This is demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration programs. doing security sector reform, having transitional justice programs to help societies come to terms with what has gone from what they've gone through before, making sure that elections take place fairly soon after the peace agreement, building the capacity of state institutions, and then, of course, making sure that there's a flourishing civil society and media as well. And this, I would argue, has led to some kind of standard toolkit that tends to get rolled out in each country. You have a cadre of international peacebuilding experts, people like me, who go around from country to country and tell governments and donors and civil society, yeah, you really need a transitional justice program. This is what it looked like in Uganda or Sierra Leone, so let's think about doing something like that in southern Thailand. And a certain specialized vernacular has developed. You'll see, I actually tried to cut down on the acronyms, but actually for most of these tools, you could come up with an acronym as well. And there's a certain language which we tend to basically go to countries, tell people this is what you need, and this is something that's basically done to post-conflict countries. And actually, if you start to look at various countries that have been going through peace processes and war to peace transitions, you see remarkable uniformity in the types of things that are done. So this table here is taken from the report and has, 7 different countries or subnational conflicts. And what you see is the same types of things are done in each of these areas. Now, I would argue there's some limitations. If we go back to how I started with actually talking about how we understand about why conflict and violence occurs, that points us to some limitations in this basic model. And I think the first is this focus on weak institutions and capacity. This idea that violence and conflict is a problem of insufficient technocratic capacity within states. And often the approach has been basically to treat the recipients of peace building, people within these countries, as deficient with weak institutions and capacity. However, if we understand that conflict and violence are essentially an incentives problem, that they occur because domestic elites in particular have interests for violence to sustain, then perhaps it's more about the political economy of those incentives rather than the kind of weakness of institutions per se. And I think if you look to the non-fragile context in middle-income countries, this is particularly clear. It's not necessarily about capacity, but often about lack of will. A second limitation, as I mentioned before, is this idea that basically we assume that internationals have a lot of leverage here. That basically we are the ones who are going to dictate whether a war to peace transition is successful or not. And again, if this is primarily a problem of domestic interests and domestic elites, then we have to question that. And that is in particular the case, again, when we look to middle-income countries. Now, if you're looking at some sub-Saharan African country where ODA accounts for 70 or 80% of the national budget, clearly you've got a bit of leverage. If you go to places like Thailand or Indonesia, where ODA is under 1% of the national budget, there's no real reason, logical reason to think that internationals necessarily are going to have the kind of vast power in shaping dynamics on the ground that we would think. So what the second half of the paper then tries to do is, what if we have this problem of some misalignment between how international peace building is done and the nature of the problem? Are there ideas out there that may help us come up with some new areas or some new approaches to dealing with this? And as Tom mentioned before, there's been basically a growing movement within the development sector towards people starting to think through, maybe we need to start to think about the politics more, and we need to find more flexible, iterative, adaptive ways that understand local context, that work together with domestic actors, and that may be effective. And essentially, we have not seen that articulated very well in the peace-building field. So what the paper tries to do is to take some of those ideas and to try and make clear what the implications may be for peace-building programming. And just to finish off, I just want to walk through a few of these. So the paper provides a basic general framework, and then Steve and George are going to talk a little bit about what this might mean in practice in the 2 countries that they work on. So the first is this assumption that weak institutions and capacity are the problem. What the working politically literature tells us that actually we need to understand the logic and incentives of political elites within countries if you want to be effective. And that perhaps we need to find ways to shape those in ways that aren't just about technical capacity building. Second limitation, that the approaches are based primarily on fragile states. I think what the thinking and working politically literature tells us is each country and context is different, and that we actually need to understand those countries and those locations as they are. And that requires much more contextual knowledge and the ability to adapt to the problems as they are on the ground. A third thing, as I mentioned, the standard toolkit of pre-planned interventions. What the thinking and working politically literature and movement tells us is that solutions are not necessarily about best practice. You can't just export something from one country to another. Rather, you need to understand the issues on the ground and you need to adapt approaches as you go along. Fourth, this idea that the way out of conflict towards sustainable peace is to build best practice liberal capitalist economic systems. Again, the thinking and working politically literature tells us we need to be much more humble, that we don't necessarily have the answers up front about what types of state forms are necessarily going to be the ones that are going to sustain peace. And that we need to be kind of open-minded about this and again adapt as we go along, trialing approaches, experimenting and learning as we go. Fifth, that the focus is overwhelmingly on state processes, and yet in many countries that are going through war to peace transitions, power is often located outside of the state in informal leaders and hybrid institutions. And so I think the lesson is you've got to work where power is situated rather than necessarily thinking through a classic model of partnering with state institutions. And finally, this assumption that externals are the most influential, that people like the donors and organizations like the Asia Foundation are the ones that kind of dictate how a peace process is going to go. And rather, I think the lesson learned from the broader work on thinking and working politically is you've got to build domestic coalitions. That essentially you've got to partner with people within countries and you've got to come in behind various leaders, various reformers within countries if you want to be effective. So just to sum up about this project, this paper is just an initial attempt to articulate some ideas around that. We're very aware that there's probably some weaknesses in it, but the next steps forward will be for us to write some country case studies. George is going to write one on Nepal, Steve on the Philippines, and then some of my colleagues in Myanmar are going to write one on Myanmar. And this will try to apply the framework to the experience of actually working in those countries and say, to what extent does the framework hold up? Are there ways we can refine it? And how do we start to make more practical the suggestions that I've outlined today? So that's all from me. I'll hand over to my colleagues who will start to put some meat on this by talking about Nepal and Philippines.
So, this is my attempt to look through the framework that Patty has set up. But before I do that, I'll give you a little bit of background of how we got to where we are in the Asia Foundation's work in the peace process in the Philippines. The first thing is the peace process environment in the Philippines. We've had a number of peace agreements that have not worked. And so part of the problem in trying to reach any agreement or implement any agreement is people begin to believe that it will never work. And this goes way back with the Moro National Liberation Front in the 1976 Tripoli Agreement. They had a autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao after the EDSA revolution that ousted Marcos and brought in Cory Aquino. There was a so-called final peace agreement with the Moro National Liberation Front, and they've been arguing for 20 years about whether or not it's been implemented and reached a tentative agreement, at least in the argument, last month in Jeddah. And then with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, after 10 years of negotiation, they reached the so-called NOAA AD, but it was declared unconstitutional and we had to go back. So now we have a 2014 comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro, which is to be implemented in a law through the Philippine Congress, the so-called Bangsamoro Basic Law. Unfortunately, that law stalled in Congress and they decided to give up under the current administration, which exits at the end of June, and there will be a new administration taking power in July. There's lots of people in this space, given this time, particularly after the 1996 final peace agreement. USAID, UNDP, both were doing considerable amount of work after 1996. JICA has been doing all kinds of work down there. AusAid's been big in the space, World Bank. Konrad Adenauer Stiftung has been consistently down there, a German Party Foundation. They do try innovative approaches, and as I repeatedly say in front of poor Patty, that I have no opinion about whether or not there's a standard toolkit, because what I see on the ground is a whole bunch of different things, people trying stuff, although there's evidence that there are some standardization. And the Asia Foundation's competitive advantage is its on-the-ground presence, and I'll talk about a couple of work streams there. We started working in local government in 2001, just before the September 11th. I often hasten to say that we weren't working in Mindanao as a reaction to September 11th. And so we started working with municipal governments or with the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao. Then as things began to look in the middle of the decade, last decade, 10 years ago, that things were going to reach an agreement, we started working with the nascent institutions being set up under the Bangsamoro, the Bangsamoro Leadership and Management Institute, the Bangsamoro Development Authority. Both of these are linked to the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, who's in negotiations with the government. Then there was a horrible massacre in 2009 in one of the provinces down in Mindanao, and we helped try to bring that order back into that chaos. And then part of the problems in the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao have to do with rampant cheating in elections, and we helped support efforts to clean up the voters list and reduce it by about 30% back in 2011 as part of a reform effort. At the same time, and somewhat separately, we were working on community-level conflicts. The average person down there experiences conflict in terms of between clans, not the separatist insurgency, not class conflict, but clan conflict, feuds, if you will. The local name for it is Rood. So we had a lot of analytic work on that, but we also started supporting groups doing mediation. So we mediated something on the order of 300 or 400 of such clan conflicts down over the last few years. So when it came time in 2009 to have an international contact group join the negotiations after the disruption caused by that 2008 failed Memorandum of Agreement on Ancestral Domain, the Asia Foundation was invited to join that international contact group. So for 4 years, I was going to the negotiations in Kuala Lumpur, sitting in the room with the negotiations, speaking when spoken to, because we're sitting at the back of the room, right? But often it was a channel for providing technical assistance to both sides, particularly the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, on things on which we have knowledge, like local government finances and the like. But beginning as it became clear that implementation would be where the action is, we switched over to the third-party monitoring team, and that's where we are now. Third-party monitoring team just issued its annual public report last Friday. You can find it on the web, or you can give me your email address and I can send it off to you. So that's where we are as a foundation. We try to focus our efforts on reform that we call transformational, and we've got several different criteria for that. And in this case, what we're talking about is trying to pass the Bangsamoro Basic Law as implementation of the Comprehensive Agreement on the Bangsamoro. We reduce the conflict in Mindanao, but the scale goes beyond the autonomous region and nearby areas, but also nationwide. Because, for instance, if the separatist insurgency goes away, then the armed forces of the Philippines can reorient itself from a land-based internal security operations to more maritime, given all the problems in the West Philippines, South China Sea. Sustainability, this would be a genuine change in the political settlement. People's incentives would change. Is it feasible? That was the question. And as I've noted, it's already stalled in Congress, and so even with presidential support, strong presidential support, it turned out not to be politically feasible. So what we try to do is kind of map into Patty's categories the sorts of things we're doing. Understanding in depth, we did a lot of various kinds of analytic work that's ongoing. I mean, we're in the field now with another survey about people's reactions in Mindanao to the stalling of the Bangsamoro Basic Law. And part of the way we learn things is our constant engagement with local actors, where we find out what's going on. We understand and adapt to the local context. We have a deep prior engagement. We try to adjust. We try to be flexible. So in January 2015, there was a horrific incident down in Mindanao where they were doing a police operation that went wrong. 44 policemen were killed, 17 or 18 MILF, and 7 civilians, and there was an enormous uproar. And it was all over the newspapers. It stalled the hearings on the Bangsamoro Basic Law, and so we had to try to adjust both the messaging and the kinds of people we were interacting with in order to try to get the law through Congress. Patty, I'm going to shoot you in the head. So, trying to get away from best practices. After 2008, there was a lot of talk about DDR. And demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration is an anathema to the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. I mean, you don't demobilize people who are already living in communities. You don't need to reintegrate them, they live in communities. So the talk is about normalization and confidence building and transformation of the camps and so on and so forth. So it's a much different kind of thing than the sort of put them in cantonments and reintegrate them into the armed forces and so on. We try to bridge social capital through interfaith dialogues with the Grand Mufti of the MILF and the Cardinal of the Catholic Church getting together, but also having the local clergy at the lower level have more or less constant interaction. Trying to take iterative approaches, and could you click now? We have a quick slide here. This is the sort of thing that we try to get done, and it gives you a flavor for how we move it. We whatever it is we do, we have an analysis of the current situation, and we have a development outcome we want to have happen. And so we do the technical and political analysis at the beginning, and we start to take some action. And the idea is that if you take action and get a reform, it will change the incentives. But the fact of the matter is you're not smart enough to do this all up front, right? And so what we do is we start trying to do some work. As we do some work, sometimes it's successful and we are moving forward and they learn more and we can expand the coalition. Sometimes it's not successful, but that also teaches you something. And so you have to keep trying to move forward, moving iteratively. You're not in any linear fashion moving from one point to the other. Somebody in the Thinking and Working Politically talked about sailboats rather than trains. Trains run along a track, sailboat has to weave back and forth to get into place. And so basically we try to get clarity from rapid repetition of this cycle. Try to learn by doing. So some of these things haven't worked, right? We were trying to harmonize the communications between the Bangsamoro institutions and the government. Office of the Presidential Assistant on the Peace Process, and failed. We got some harmonization with the Philippine Information Agency, but the OPOP had a different set of communication protocols. There is a Moro National Liberation Front, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. The women were very much interested in figuring out what their role was, but it turned out in the end that they wanted to take separate tracks. The MNLF women and the MILF women taking separate tracks the way the main separatist organizations do, the MILF and the MNLF. On the other hand, there was a peace council announced a year ago where various very prominent citizens, Jaime Augusto Isabel de Ayala or Cardinal Tagle, were part of this peace council. And so we were able to offer secretariat technical assistance to them and help them move very quickly within 6 weeks to come up with recommendations to Congress. Try to work where the power is, where legitimacy is, including hybrid institutions. Basically, we're looking for people who are willing to spend their political capital to do reforms. And this could be businessmen. Businessmen are very much on board in this because of the economic opportunities that are available, which would shift the incentives down in Mindanao considerably. Finally, we work with local coalitions. Basically, you've got to be willing to disappear. I like that phrase. Willingness to disappear. You don't put your logos on stuff. You let them take the lead, and you try to figure out what is possible in any given situation. So, this is our analysis map. This basically shows people who are pro or anti-reform and how much political influence they have. The president is very much pro-reform and he's got the most influence, but he's got to persuade Congress to help build the Bangsamoro Basic Law. So we undertake various activities to try to help move that forward. We bring civil society and help them with messaging, help them bring together ideas about what is, if you're trying to balance the needs of women's representation or indigenous peoples with the agreement of the comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro, what sorts of messages do you have? We're trying to help the business sector coalesce, beginning the Makati, the National Capital Region business sector, but also the Mindanao Business Council. We try to work with local elected officials to try to get them to understand they're anti because this is a new way of doing things. So, for instance, in the political party building that the Moro Islamic Liberation Front has engaged in, they have said they will not run candidates for local office. They will only run candidates for the regional office, the new Bangsamoro, which will replace the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao, which sort of keeps the local elected officials off the table because they're not being threatened by the new arrangements. Finally, the senator who was in the upper house in charge of the law, we were trying to work with him and his staff to help him understand how he might get closer to the reform that the Moro Islamic Liberation Front was interested in. I would say that that was not very successful because the bill he introduced was considerably distant from the Bangsamoro Basic Law as desired by the MILF. Finally, what happened, we had this ad hoc committee on the BBL, and when this horrific accident happened, this encounter January 25th, 2015 happened, basically they were persuaded to become less reform-oriented, and that's what stalled the Bangsamoro Basic Law. So, in peace processes, implementation is key. We are now in hibernation for the implementation. All the ceasefire mechanisms continue to work very well, but the political process is going to be on a pause until we get a new administration and the new administration decides what it wants to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve, for taking 2 out of my 12 minutes. I don't have a slideshow, but I'm always happy to talk about Nepal and our engagement there. Tom spoke of my work in Afghanistan. I won't be using those examples today, but wanted to briefly introduce you to our work in Nepal. In many ways, the Asia Foundation's direct on-the-ground engagement in Nepal very closely parallels modern political development in a way in Nepal. Since 1991, when the first people's movement dislodged the absolute monarchy and the first sort of round of serious engagement with democratic reform began, we've been on the ground working on various democracy and governance programs in addition to the bread and butter work that we do across Asia. As you know, when the first set of democratic coalition started ruling in Nepal or governing in Nepal, that was a Freudian slip because they rule and they don't really govern. The insurgency in Nepal started within about 4 years of that, if you recall, in 1994-95. When a group of dissenting political actors were not accommodated in democratic discussion, in democratic contestation, and they took their dissent underground and engaged in violent protest, if you will, for 10 years, resulting in at least 15,000 dead and many hundreds of thousands affected. So the insurgency in Nepal came at the time when Nepal was trying to be serious about democratic progress in reaction to absolute monarchy of 30, 40 years. In addition to that, many of you follow Nepal know that insurgency ended with a peace agreement that was brokered by India and in 2005, 2006, which resulted then in an interim constitution and a constituent assembly election in 2008. So since 2008 and until very recently, Nepal has been engaged in the exercise of writing a new constitution. So after almost 8 years of going back and forth between the now above ground Maoist party and the many other 30-odd parties in Nepal, they finally agreed on a constitution on September 20, 2015. So 10 years of war, 4 years of democratic experimentation ahead of that, and 8 years of negotiation afterwards, we have a new constitution in Nepal. But one could contend that absent only the violent expressions, all the underlying elements that created that insurgency remain very much resonant in Nepal. Some of you who follow what's happened since September know that we were subject to 5-6 months of a blockade in the Tarai, which was simply symptomatic of the anger that the peoples of that location felt about the political settlement surrounding marginalization in the new constitution. All this to say that the new constitution in many ways continues the fine tradition of political marginalization that has been practiced in Nepal for over 50 years. And so democracy in word, but not necessarily in action. And I think that we are sowing the seeds for further conflict in Nepal if we don't accommodate these various contending political formations. Our history of engagement in Nepal, therefore, has tried to be helpful to the transition. We say that we are trying to promote or support a peaceful political transition. And that effort to support also reflects the way we work. And perhaps in my chapter, Patty, I'll focus more on that rather than trying to understand particular programs we do. It's, I would argue, the way that we have tried to work that has helped us be adaptable to the emerging context, and that enabled us to build trust over the initial years of our engagement, such that when the chance came to support various peace initiatives, we were in the right place at the right time and had, if you want, a web of relationships that were considered valuable. Beginning with, just like the Philippine office, the Asia Foundation in Nepal worked for several years. We are in our 14th year now, or 15th year of supporting alternate dispute resolution at the local level in a comprehensive way across hundreds of locations in Nepal. That began very early on in our engagement, and that enabled us to understand the local level dynamics ahead of the conflict. I'm not saying that we expected the conflict and therefore understood the dynamics. It's just that the way we worked at the time to identify mediators and disputants at the local level, to work on village level conflict, household level disputes, enabled us to understand the dynamics of evolving disputes, such that we had a pretty good grasp of village level politics. And then we found ourselves in the throes of the insurgency, and during the insurgency, even the Maoist kangaroo courts were referring some of their disputes to our mediators because of the perceived neutrality of the process, but more satisfaction with regard to the settlements that were achieved. They were not feud, they were not blood feud-like settlements. They were more facilitated. So our mediation program grew from being one of mediating disputes related to household issues and inheritance and land into this whole other model that we began to understand only later after the conflict had ended. In fact, mediators, because they are from the local areas, also were able to promote relationships that were not contentious. They were able to, what we call, engage in interactions that result in social harmony. Now, for 3 years, we've been engaging with the London School of Economics under a different funded program to understand how do you gather the evidence for social harmony. Because it's not really a Western term in many ways, but this is what the disputants and mediators reflect back to us, saying that, well, yes, you settled our dispute, but more than that, we like each other more. It doesn't matter to me if that person's an untouchable, or that person's a Brahmin, or that person's some other caste.
what you've helped facilitate, help us relate to each other in more peaceful ways and more harmonious ways. So we are still working on that. There are papers up on the LSE website that we've both produced where we've disagreed with LSE's evidence, or LSE is saying that we don't have the evidence, and they've said that, well, we need to do more work on this. So one is that our mediation program helped generate outcomes that were more than just settlement of disputes. In addition to that, it helped place us and locate us in local spaces where conflicts were emerging. And partly because of that, and partly because of the way we work politically at the national level, we were asked to support Track 1.5 process that was formally agreed between the political parties and the government, support negotiation amongst themselves. This is called the Nepal Transition to Peace process, which was supported by the Ministry of Peace and Reconstruction. It's the only formally agreed dialogue mechanism, aside from the standard peace-building mechanism, where even if political actors in Nepal were not talking to each other formally, visibly, we were very much engaged in keeping them talking to each other. We did that for 6 years until last year, and that was the second program that we took on. But that was more of an inherited program. We didn't design it. We were asked to support it, and we can go back and forth in question and answer on how that worked. But the third program then is one that really typifies the way we work politically, I feel, which is using the lessons and the technology of dialogue at the local level and that of dialogue at the national level. We are building currently for the last 2-3 years a program of what we call a regional dialogue. And that has to do with our anticipating forthcoming conflicts surrounding the federal provisions in the Constitution. As I said earlier, many of these provisions are already causing a lot of anxiety with those who are historically marginalized. We fully expect some of them to deteriorate into violent expressions if they are not headed off at the pass, if there is not peaceful dialogue, if there isn't facilitated arenas of interaction that encourage people to vocalize rather than use violent forms. And so we've adapted from both ends, from the national level, our experience of engaging with powerful political actors, but also our experience of identifying local level actors who are trust builders, who can repair torn social fabric. They're usually retired school teachers, retired army people. As you know, Nepal has a lot of retired army personnel who work for various armies, Indian, British, Singapore, etc. And then you have others who seek to be bridge builders. And so we are really, it's a sort of a searching way of working, because we really don't know how this would work. What we really want to be ready in 2016, 17, 18 to preempt in many ways, to anticipate where hotspots of violence could be. And we already know some of them, and we were working with local groups of facilitators who are from political parties and others. But we also want to be able to surveil across the country, and another effort that maybe Patty or Steve didn't mention, which is violence monitoring, which is another area that Asia Foundation works in some countries. But we are deploying that effort now in Nepal also, so that we are able to, ahead of time, pick up some indicators of huddling behavior, of expressing behavior, where we think that it might deteriorate very quickly. We've done that with relation to elections. A lot of people do that with relation to elections, where you're sort of making sure that people don't violently protest the outcomes or the process of elections. But we are not trying to do that with regard to the constitutional rollout. So these are the three levels at which we seek to support. I wouldn't say that we do support because the evidence is still coming in. Certainly we support peaceful engagement, and that would be a very useful thing. In Afghanistan, I remember some ambassadors used to call us in and saying, "What are you guys doing? They're still violently contending." And I say, as long as the people don't walk away from the table, as long as they're talking to each other, there's less reason for them to engage in other forms of violence, other forms of dissent. And I think that's what we've done in Nepal also. So when we say we support the peace, it could just be bringing people to the table and keeping them there, not necessarily achieving some sort of a settlement. That's for them to decide. But even an outcome of supporting peace must be forms of dialogue, facilitated and otherwise. So this is what we're trying to figure out, and this is what I'll be trying to write about. Thank you. Thanks, George. Great. Okay, so we're going to move to Q&A.
I want to just start off by giving sort of two anecdotes and sort of framing the challenge a little bit. Hearing the way that these programs are working in the field is very interesting and are good examples of how this sort of, more flexible, iterative, politically smart programming is working. The challenge for us, particularly on the donor side, is to figure out how do we support this kind of thing, and how do we do it in a way that's, that encourages this kind of approach, and how do we do it at scale, right? So there's some real challenges with that. So I mean, just an anecdote. I was in a separate conversation with another partner organization. We were talking about Nepal, and they were saying, "Oh boy, this problem in the Terai of groups feeling pushed out by the new constitution, and what they really need is some federalism and constitution experts to come help them think through different models." And our reaction was, really? I mean, don't you think really what you really need is somebody who actually knows the different actors there and can help mediate and negotiate? And that the actual outcome, the plausible outcome to actually bring everybody into the tent is going to be very, very unique to Nepal. So what does, federalism in some other country, what does that have to do with Nepal, right? Another key point where this has come up recently is there was a review of UN peacebuilding, which just came out by a high-level panel. And one of the issues that they focused on was the concept of national ownership. And the idea basically was that national ownership among the donor community has too often been equated purely as government ownership. But in these countries, if you look at, for example, the southern Philippines, trying to support activities that are solely driven by governments without understanding the concerns, the interests of the minority populations or of the other actors that are critical in a peace process is a recipe for disaster. So the Philippines is a very important case because actually that's a case where the government very much has a peace negotiation on the agenda. But there's other countries where that's not the case. And so there's really, it's incredibly important now to rethink what does national ownership mean. It has to mean something beyond just government ownership. It's got to be a broader conception. And so there's a number of factors that are playing out where the international community is really trying to think about how we do this differently. So the challenge, in my view, is, I mean, if we look at this kind of work in its essence, right, usually starts with in-depth analysis over many years, followed by understanding the particular dynamics and the actors involved, leading then to development of networks and trust, working on these very difficult issues, and then, only then, can you actually do the kind of flexible, politically smart programming. So the challenge for us is that most procurement processes that are designed to support competitive procurement, that often results in a newcomer organization coming to a place that doesn't have that breadth and that depth of experience and knowledge. It promotes the kind of best practice that we see over and over, right? Similarly, because the aid community is so focused on prescribing problems on best practice, log frames, results agenda, we tend to get programs that are highly structured, highly sort of prescribed. This is what we're going to do in month 23, right? When in fact, you probably shouldn't have any idea what you're going to do in month 23, let alone month 3, right? And so these are some of the challenges that the donors are struggling with to figure out how we can structure programs to support this kind of work. But it's quite a battle. So just trying to frame it there. Let's go ahead and open up to questions. Scott in the back first.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Scott Worden, I'm with the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, directing a lessons learned program looking at Afghanistan's case. I want to make a comment and a question. The comment is, all of this resonates very well, even without you speaking about Afghanistan, George, briefly. So, in your case studies, Philippines, Myanmar, and others, I would certainly, reflect that Afghanistan is a worthy exemplar of this problem of thinking politically in development. The question really follows from what Tom's remarks, and he took a couple of the ideas that I was going to say, is, we're interested with Afghanistan, thinking about lessons learned, and I think it's more general about why doesn't this happen more often? You know, all of this resonates, I think, very loudly to me, to a lot of development professionals that deal with these issues, and it's not. I think the problem is not as much lack of recognition or understanding or agreement on the challenge of thinking politically, but rather how to implement it. And I think there are two key words that come to my mind. One is risk, and the other is expertise. So in bureaucratic organizations, you have this risk aversion. You know, how do we trust with a big process, I'll say like Afghanistan, but others, that's politically important, that is very expensive. How do we trust organizations for experimentation? And certainly, you know, the U.S. government on its own, you know, you guys as NGOs have a little more flexibility. But there's not that tolerance for risk with these high-profile cases, so it therefore becomes, you know, I think the toolkit becomes an attractive mitigation for if it fails, at least we use something that everybody else used, and don't blame us. On the expertise side, and this is to Tom's point, you know, I think you do need a long-term involvement, and you made a good point about the procurement practice, but if you also just look at how the Foreign Service works, how rotations work particularly in conflict environments, you know, you don't often have officials staying in place for long enough to really develop that expertise on their own. All right, those are observations. So the questions are, you know, do you find that these are true, and kind of what's the state of research and study on, you know, not just the problem, but why it keeps perpetuating itself? I'm curious whether you've investigated that at all. Thank you.
Okay, let's take two more, and can you please turn on the microphone?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Right here, please.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's on.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much. I can only echo what the colleague previously said and what you said. I worked for USAID for a number of years. I'm currently at the U.S. Institute of Peace. So the problems pointed out in time frame, expertise, funding streams, and all that are very real institutional impediments. I would just ask you, there is the New Deal for Engagement of Fragile States, which you may be familiar with. It was agreed to in Busan in January or December of 2011, which was designed to do exactly what you're talking about. Host country leadership, ownership, assessment of fragility, et cetera, et cetera. It has not worked for many of the reasons that you have mentioned, the deficits in major donor approaches to these issues. Anyway, I've not given up on the New Deal, because I think it holds out, along with what you talked about beyond the toolkit, of the best hope for actually being effective, which should be the goal of everyone. I would just add not only the institutional incentive, but also in the U.S., the Congress is a huge impediment to institutional changes to do exactly what you described. And we should not minimize the impediment of congressional impact on how USAID does business. I do have a question on the Philippines to Mr. Rood. Question, you talked about USAID and DFID and others who were there. What about U.S. military engagement in the conflict, the ongoing challenge of a settlement, long-term peace settlement in Mindanao? You didn't mention the military. I'd be interested in your take on that. Thank you.
All right, we'll do one more question. Over here, please. Right here in front.
Thank you for your comments today. My name is Rosalind. I'm from the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. My question is specifically about the Philippines, but hopefully not exclusively about the Philippines. So women have played a significant role both in the formal process, specifically related to the MILF peace process, and on the technocratic sides of both parties engaged in that process. And so my question is, what role do you see as women playing uniquely in the negotiations themselves and in cementing the CAB? And then also, what role can they play or should they be playing in the passage of the BBL? And are there lessons for other cases in the region and for the Asia Foundation within the construct of the Philippines case?
Great, thanks. Like first.
Yeah, it's an interesting trajectory in the women in the peace process in the Philippines. Philippines was, for instance, the first country in Asia to have a national action plan for the implementation of Security Council Resolution 1325. And from the very beginning, there have been women on the government side. Okay, the interesting evolution of women on the MILF side. As negotiations started up again with the new administration in mid-2010, the MILF announced that they were going to have some women consultants for the first time. Because they were basically tired of getting beat up by donors for not having women on their negotiating panel. They never did get women on the negotiating panel, but they started bringing women to the technical panel. And of course, they're so smart, they started relying on them all the time. So that in the end, they became part of the MILF's Multi-World Transition Commission, crafting the basic law. Now, there is a difficult balancing act, particularly, for instance, if you take a female lawyer who's working, she's a Muslim lawyer working for the MILF, you know, she's got a client, but she also has her own ideals and so on and so forth, a long-time feminist advocate. Because, for instance, some of the problem in getting the law through Congress was that civil society was not speaking with a single voice. So that rather than supporting the bill as had been hammered out by the MILF with participation of women that had provisions on women and so on, many women's organizations pressed for more. And so the message started to get muddled as congressmen who were in somewhat favorable to the whole idea would say, well, wait a second, we're hearing a different message that we shouldn't support this bill, we need to amend it. Whereas the Moral Islamic Liberation Front is saying, well, we put this bill together, we need to get it through. Same sort of thing happened, it's not exclusive to the women's advocates, same sort of thing happened on indigenous peoples advocates, where there are provisions for indigenous peoples in the law, and the indigenous peoples advocates, some of whom say this is not sufficient. So it was a problem, and it continues to be a problem, and there was just another article where the UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples' Rights, who's a Filipina from the north, says that it's inadequate still in the law, and so that message does muddle things and gives opponents entries and excuses. That said, it's clear that particularly in terms of easy discussion across what used to be a dividing line, but after a couple of years isn't so much anymore, the MILF and the government, the women are much easier talking to each other. They're, it's almost stereotypical, but it certainly is the case that the communication channels were open and flowing, and eventually persuaded the MILF that this is a good thing, so that in the end, the chairman of the MILF, Chairman Iqbal, the negotiating panel, said, who had been uncomfortable with having to negotiate against a woman because he's not used to that sort of interaction in his culture, said in February in Kuala Lumpur, I sincerely hope that any new administration reappoints Miriam Coronel Ferrer as the peace panel. I mean, he really came to respect her. Similarly, I would say that with regard to the political party work or the political participation work we were doing, again, the women, both Moral National Liberation Front and Moral Islamic Liberation Front, in their different ways, were very much interested in how they could be part of this. And the striking thing about the MNLF is, they come from a secular nationalist movement. It's almost, the same kind of organizing that Communist New People's Army does, so they're okay. But the Moral Islamic Liberation Front operate under different cultural and religious constraints, and so they have different ideas about what it means. So it's very interesting, and I hope people continue to look into this. We're doing some research on it because it's very dynamic and certainly doing. Very quickly on the U.S. military role. Not that forgetful yet. I have a famously bad memory, but I do remember that. The U.S. military, they were joint special operations, and special ops sort of buys into everything we say, right? I mean, they believe in local knowledge and stuff like that. And although they were on 6 month rotations, they were often repeated rotations. and so they did gain a lot of local knowledge. They did a good job at doing something that was once pointed out in a Lowy paper on the Mindanao called A Gamble Worth Taking. They did a good job of separating out counterterrorism from counterinsurgency. So it was clear in their operations that they were going after terrorists, the Abu Sayyaf in particular, and not supporting counterinsurgency. And so it did not cause an adverse reaction from the MILF, which, as you think about it, is actually quite remarkable.
So why doesn't this happen more often? When we were representing this, I think it was yesterday at the World Bank, the day before yesterday at the World Bank, one of the World Bank people made the comment, well, it's not really fair. You guys have got a competitive advantage because you actually know something about the countries you're working in. As if we're somewhat cheating or something, right? I think it is a fair question, in particular for larger organizations. You know, what are the constraints that stop them from doing this? And I think it's useful to think about two things, right? So, you know, what are the structures that prevent that? And you outlined some of those. You know, this paper, along with a whole bunch of other things, is part of an advocacy attempt to try and get people to start to pay attention to these. But we're not naive, right? You know, it's not, you know, I firmly believe that international agencies, if they posted people for longer, if they emphasized language training, if they find ways to incentivize, you know, making networks with local people, if they hired more kind of political science types rather than others, or, you know, or anthropologists or historians, then you would get better outcomes on the ground, right? So, you know, this is part of an advocacy thing. It's obviously not going to be changed in this paper, but I think it's important that we you know, we continue to push. But I think it's also true that even within those incentive systems and bureaucratic structures, good stuff can be done. So I think what I'd like to do is, in addition to writing our 3 case studies based on, you know, the cheating NGO, how we do it, to also, you know, maybe commission a piece on, you know, what interesting things have been done from a larger donor, and you know, maybe try and convince Tom to write that, because I think there are islands of very interesting things that have been done across most agencies, and maybe that then may be helpful, you know, not just how do we change those structures, but what can be done within those structures, and you know, and start a conversation on how we start to move that forward, even within the constraints.
I like to think of ourselves as the little NGO that could. Anyway, you know, it's interesting that the community of practice now uses the acronym TWP. I prefer to put a / after T, because thinking politically is not the same as working politically, as Scott and others were saying, and that's absolutely true. And the difference just might be that almost every major development actor now thinks politically, but doesn't act, work politically. And that's where I think we are the little NGO that could. But why not, you know, why despair about that? I think there are many ways that that can be addressed, at least in modest ways. One of the things that's always irked me about our community is that we maintain a certain information asymmetry. We fund studies that are deeply analytical and thoughtful within our agencies and organizations, but we don't share all of it or most of it. We tend to do that because it maintains a competitive edge. It gets us into certain places where you know, funds may be forthcoming, and in many ways, you know, that reflects a private sector sort of industrial approach to aided development, if you will, which I think is the ugly side of it. And in many ways, working politically, in my experience, requires us to let go of that practice. I always speak of working politically, especially in Afghanistan, when Scott and I both worked there together as well. Sharing information really aligns interests and builds trust. And if anyone wants to work politically in addition to thinking politically, there must be that give and take. I'm not saying reveal everything. There are many times when we know so much about what's going on, but we decline to provide information, whether it's to donors and others, And it's a very fine line between being the agent of some power and being the little NGO that could. And so I think it's possible to build in a layer of activity, if you will, that addresses that information asymmetry. And I ask donors, at least in the countries I work in, to think of funding analysis and research that informs more than just their own internal strategies. Because in many ways, the kind of analysis we do really does reveal not only the interests and incentives of the actors, whether they're donors or others, they also, in many ways, give you critical information about the spheres of influence, the kinds of positions of power, the origins of ideas that matter. And in my view, in volatile or extremely dynamic political contexts, operating in the absence of that information really sets you up for serious risk-taking or unforeseen risks and all kinds of costs, which is the other aspect of working politically that I want to emphasize. Yeah, I feel it's my duty. There are some of us who proselytize working politically to the extent that we forget to mention that working politically can have enormous costs because we invest in individuals in addition to institutions. And when these individuals walk away from the relationship, you've lost a lot of investment. And so our second generation effort in working politically involves investing more in relationships, web-like relationships, if you will, nested relationships that require us to invest in more than one or two powerful actors. It's got to do with actors that may be powerful, institutions that may be relevant, or even beginning to think about organic ways of seeding the rudiments of future influential actors. And so it's a very searching, iterative way to work, and it requires being risk-able.
Let me just also add one or two things, and then we'll go more quickly on the next one. On the New Deal question, now there's a review going on of the New Deal right now. We'll find out a bit more. I think that the basic problems are, for one, it hasn't really been taken up, in part because it hasn't been internalized by donors, but as well, like for example, of the, say, 10 countries that we work in that are conflict affected or fragile, only 3 are actually G7 plus donors and have actually, governments, and have actually signed up to it. So it's actually still a fairly niche agreement in a lot of ways. So I think there's a lot of things that need to be reviewed with the New Deal. But just on Scott's point, why it hasn't happened, I think that the super tanker of the aid industry is starting to turn, right? But the old ship is groaning, and as it sort of moves into that turn, right? This is playing out in a lot of sort of funny ways on the ground or in conversations. Conversation I was recently a part of, looking at a new education project in southern Philippines, and the design team put up this super intricate, sort of log frame, sort of causal map, right? Inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and about 6 or 7 really, really technical sort of processes and systems are going to improve, right? And our feedback was, can you just take the activities and outputs part, just get rid of all of that, right? Just tell us the inputs, the outcomes, and how you're going to figure out what to do in the middle, and who's going to be involved in that. Maybe frame it in key sort of thematic areas. But, and their reaction was, oh my God, can you do that? Is that okay? Right? So, and I'm starting to be a part of many conversations like that. Now that's for a $50 million project, right? So it's starting to change, but a lot of it is signaling, a lot of it is sort of creating space for it, but it's starting to change, I think. So it's, that gives me some pause for hope. Okay, so let's go to another round, and let's try in the second round to keep it a little bit more brief. Down here in the front, and then we'll go to the back next.
Hi, my name is Kevin from Freedom House. 2 quick questions. One is, I think in a couple places, the speakers talked about these analyses of power and influence. I think it sounds critical, but I'm just wondering if you comment a little bit on the best ways you found to do those analyses. approaches that are accurate. Because sometimes if you have an incorrect power analysis, it can lead to action that doesn't really help or doesn't help much as it should. The second question is the idea of Asia Foundation and many other groups in this supertanker, as you were talking about, Thomas, being viewed as foreign influence, and you actually mentioned this, Patrick. Is there a pushback on this? Have you found pushback on this? I've focused a lot on China in my work, and granted, this is a very different country politically, but there's a massive amount of pushback right now. There's actually a formal law being passed to restrict and even criminalize aid from abroad. So if you could comment a little bit on that as it interacts with what you talked about so far. Thanks.
Person in the back.
Good morning. I'm Najla Abdisamad, currently with the U.S. Afghan Women's Council at Georgetown University. I've also worked on the perimeters of the peace process in Mindanao formerly, and also in Jordan on the periphery of the conflict in Iraq. So needless to say, my cup of frustration runneth over. So thank you so much for the opportunity for this dialogue. My question is, have you a case that you can share with us where international donor support for a peace process anywhere in the world has worked?
Great. And there is another right here on the aisle, please.
Hi, my name is Rosie Keegle. I'm with the Open Society Foundations, and I just had a question about Sri Lanka because I think in the past years since elections, it's emerged as one of those places that's sort of a donor hotspot. And so, given the new framework that was outlined, I would just be interested to hear what kind of work the Asia Foundation is doing there.
Great. And the gentleman right here on the aisle.
Yeah, Ken Meyer toward WorldDocs. It's my understanding that the U.S. government requires any NGO which receives funds from it to provide information on the locals that they work with. Does the Asia Foundation receive any money from the U.S. government and conform to that requirement?
Okay. All right. Let's go with that. Patty, you want to start?
I'll take some of them. The question on how to do decent analysis of power interest. I think, everyone loves to do conflict analyses and political economy assessments. This is not what we're talking about here, right? We're not talking about doing specific research projects or kind of particular analyses that then get documented, that get, printed in nice color and then put on the shelf, right? Now, I like writing that kind of stuff as much as anyone, right? But I think what we're really talking about is how you build systems and norms and practices within your organization so that you're getting that information, you're discussing it internally within your team, and you're adapting your approaches as you go along. So I don't think it's necessarily about getting a really smart Harvard guy to come in and do this super duper assessment with some cutting edge framework, right? It's about basically building intuition within your team, building knowledge flows, and then building kind of norms through which you're discussing that within your organization and being able to respond. Has international involvement worked anywhere? Sure. But the reason you get a successful peace agreement is not only because of the internationals. One of the arguments is internationals can help a lot around the sides. I think the Philippines is one case, right, where things like the third-party monitoring team and so on have played a very important role. Actually, where I worked a lot of the time as well, there was very good work done by many international organizations in translating a lot of the peace process into programs on the ground. The argument is not that internationals are useless. Maybe that we should just kind of set the bar a bit lower of expectations. That, it's not going to be the international solely determine whether something's successful or not. Sri Lanka, I can maybe say a little bit, maybe others know a bit more. We do a whole range of different projects there. The ones that I'm most familiar with are a program somewhat like the one that George runs in Nepal of doing local conflict mediation, which is run for a long time, I think about 15 years or so, which basically works with the government to have a network of local mediators pretty much across the country. And since the end of the war, we've been working to expand those mediation centres up into the north and the east to deal in particular with a lot of the post-conflict programs. And they've started to move away from just doing interpersonal disputes to working around things like land issues, which are much more complex. We've also been working with the police as well on a community policing program. As you can imagine, that's quite challenging. You know, the police became very militarized throughout the war there. And so a lot of that is about how to kind of change mindsets within the police force so that they think about serving the community, and you start to rebuild those relationships between the community and the security sector. We do other stuff around economic governance and so on, but I'm probably not the best qualified to talk to that. In Sri Lanka, I think at the moment we have a recognition that with the new government and with things being that bit further along, there's a need to recalibrate our program. So we're actually coming towards the end of a process where we've been doing a strategic assessment together with a lot of the donors and many local groups to start to think through how we respond to new issues like rising intercommunal violence, religious chauvinism in parts of the country and so on. And so I'm not quite sure where the program will go in the coming year, but I think it will evolve. I'll leave the other questions to
I'll start with the last question first and then try to get back to the others. The Asia Foundation, depending on the year and the location, is funded by up to 18 or 19 different governments around the world, and many private and other organizations. And the usual mode of funding, and I mean, we're funded between 100 million to 130 million, depending on the year as well and the location. In total, the organization programs about that much. We are also funded through a congressional appropriation, depending on which government is, in power in America. We might get $5 million or 10 million. It hovers around between 10 and 15 million, depending on who's there. But as I say, I mean, if you look at what that is in terms of our overall budget, all of which is raised competitively through bids and other processes. We have a very energetic fundraising department, and because we are not endowed, we raise almost every single dollar that we spend. And so yes, we do also have US government funding. In Nepal, we have funding for counter-trafficking, which is a major project that was competitively bid. All of our projects in Nepal are competitively bid. And there are many others. Now, to the matter of peace agreements and the sensitivity of information we have around that, I personally, I mean, even in Afghanistan, this happened with me, but in Nepal too, when I arrived from Afghanistan in 2009, Ambassador Scott DeLisi, he was saying hello to me, he's a very fine US Foreign Service officer. He said, George, we've been funding you guys here for 3 or 4 years. You still don't have a constitution, you don't really have peace, what's going on, you know? So it's one of these where, I think he was only half joking, I don't think he expected us to deliver the constitution. But there is this donor pressure to deliver on things that I consider somewhat unreasonable. And I reminded him that actually the funding to support the Nepal transition to peace mechanism was to support peaceful engagement, continued presence at the table, and we were delivering that in major ways. Having said that, I've also been in meetings with donors where they say, we fund you, tell us who came to talk about what. You know, they literally have said that to me. And there is at least, thank God, within these donor agreements, we already have these things about confidentiality. It depends on the type of agreement. The US government has 3 types, 3 modalities of funding, for example, grants, cooperative agreements, and contracts. Now, contractors have almost no choice. We typically like to compete for grants and cooperative agreements because of the way we work, and we really do like that. In some places, we do work on contracts as well. But so far, so good. We've declined funding. We've declined to provide information. It's a real struggle because if you have the wrong donor counterpart, they can make your life really miserable. In terms of peace agreements that work and not, I agree with what Patty is saying. It really depends on what you expect to measure that outcome with. In other words, if you expect to bring the peace, it may not happen. If you expect the peace to be durable, if you expect the underlying elements of the absence of peace to be addressed, that may not work. In Nepal, you could argue that the peace, the support to the peace agreement actually worked because out of the 12 points, about 9 points are now met, right? The TRC has been formed, Commission for Disappearance has been formed, Maoists are now integrated. But the question is how many Maoists out of 15,000 were integrated, right? 1,530. The rest are all out in society somewhere unhappy with the whole settlement. Now, can we expect the international to deal with that? In some cases they can, some cases they can't. In Nepal, you could make the argument that the underlying elements that led to the conflict, and I said this in the beginning, still remain very much. In many ways, they're being sharpened, and I think we are sowing the seeds for some level of conflict. Powerful actors, yeah. So there's this question of what do you do with the power analysis and how it's important to be accurate and who do you share it with. For us, I mean, the way we do some of this, I mean, generally is in addition to having really competent staff, we also have a joint appraisal, if you will, of what the context is with our counterparts in government. And so we have really, when we look at the problem, when they come to us saying, well, Nepal is going to be federal tomorrow, what do we do? How do we roll it out? You sit together and appraise that not from a technical point of view, but we look at if you're going to roll it out and it's going to take 5 to 10 years to actually do the technical rollout, who are the potential allies and who are the potential spoilers, if you will. These typically in countries like Nepal are within the bureaucracy and within political parties. So if you're in a dynamic political context, you want to be involving the thinkers of the political parties in all these early appraisals. And so if it were a technical problem-solving approach, you bring in an expert who's done this somewhere else, you sit with the prime movers at the time and figure out a solution. When we do this, nowadays we identify in 3 levels down people who could be champions and spoilers. 3 levels down, so that's very labor intensive. And so that's the other aspect of working politically. It's very labor intensive. It's not necessarily resource intensive, but spending the time to identify people, understanding who their political patron is, thinking about within political parties, because parties in Nepal, like many other places, are factionalized now. It's not enough to only speak to the gender advisor of one faction. You've got to know all the gender advisors, for example, and whether or not they rotate in and out of government. If you understand their interests ahead of time and you align them with your organization's interest in working on the issues, the costs of mobilizing, even if the government changes, are relatively lower. So not power analysis in the classic way that we've all studied in graduate school, but thinking about if that person's a figurehead, if there's an alignment of powerful people around them, influential. If they're not, we might actually jettison them. We may not even think about them. I'll give you a very clear example. The chief secretary in Nepal 2 iterations ago was someone we didn't engage with. But before that, there was a chief secretary I engaged with from when he was undersecretary to when he became chief secretary, so over a period of 11 years, right? And so it depends who that is, and then understanding if they are able to expend what we call political capital in the pursuit of mutual interest, then those are the people you want to work with. And that's what our sort of analysis shows. And this is not necessarily all written up, but it's part of how we work.
Just very briefly, in particular with the power analysis, part of what we do is we try stuff and find out what happens. And that helps us understand who's got power over which domains and willing to spend political capital. So beyond the analysis, you just do stuff and see what the reaction is. On peace processes that have worked, believe me, in 2008 I was weeping. We had 800,000 internally displaced persons after the MOAD fell apart. In the BBL, we don't have that. So we have made progress, and the internationals have had something to do with it, but again, it's domestic. On the other two that haven't been talked so much, to the specific question about information to the U.S. government, there's something called the partnership vetting system, which was rolled out in West Bank, Gaza, and now is being piloted in 4 countries. Philippines is one of them. Okay, Philippines is the only country in Asia, so it's the only country with which it's applicable. The short answer is it only became applicable in July, and we haven't signed anything with the U.S. government since then. So none of our projects are currently doing it. Certainly, we have to consider very carefully the implications of that system for our relationships with trusted partners in Mindanao, whether it be seen as providing unnecessary information to the United States government, which gets finally to the question of foreign influence. The fact of the matter is that you have to be willing to disappear. You have to be willing to let the people in the country, the domestic actors who have the legitimacy to undertake political reforms, they have to take the lead. They have to be the ones saying what the goals are. They have to be the ones saying this is what's politically possible and what's not. And we're in strictly a supporting role. And in that case, particularly you will see in the Philippines, we have formal roles. We have formal legitimacy. We've got an appointment from the government and the MILF to be on this monitoring team. So we have something we can say to those who are suspicious. But in the end, the answer has got to be this is a Filipino initiative that is being supported by the Asia Foundation, but not directly.
Great, okay, just to wrap up, the foreign influence question is a very important one. And I think it's important to distinguish between, international efforts to sort of reconfigure power, right? Or, at its most extreme, regime change, right? That is very, very different from what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is fundamentally getting behind locally led reform efforts, being mindful of politics, being mindful that you're not actually, entrenching a status quo that might be a problem, right? And working more in a tactical way to be more effective at what we're already trying to achieve, right? So if we're trying to achieve peace, to go in there and completely ignore politics, in my view, is actually, that's irresponsible, right? That's actually a poor use of taxpayer money, right? So I think we have to separate those two levels. We're not talking about, sort of tinkering with the politics of a country. We're talking about getting in behind a reformer and trying to, or a group of reformers, and helping to come up with something that's positive for the country that's being led by that country, right? So I think there's an important distinction there. So let me close there. Please join me in thanking our panelists today. Suggest you look for the report here, the Beyond the Toolkit report on the internet, and thank you very much for